All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to actually talk about how the subconscious charges, right? So we've actually building up to this for pretty much the whole curriculum. We're still going to talk more about the actual technique in Chapter 11, but now we're going to really get a sense of what's actually happening when your subconscious charges. I think I'm going to mix this video with the next section, where we're going to actually talk about similar to what we did last chapter. We're going to talk about this process in terms of what's happening when you're being entertained, and watching movies, listening to music, things like that. So I'll just go over this first point. When you charge subconscious energy, I like to think of it as being very similar to when, like a child's swing, right? So when you're on a swing, in order to properly move on a swing, so a kid's swing, you have to build up momentum, and this is done by pushing your body forward and back at the proper time. So very simple, right? So I'm basically just explaining how swings work with, these swings you see at the park, at a kid's park. So when you get on the swing, right, you obviously you're not going anywhere when you first get on. You have to build momentum up. So you have to build energy. So you would push a little bit this way, then the swing moves as you push a little bit, and then it reaches some equilibrium point and then starts to move back. And as it's moving back, you actually push your body backwards to give it momentum. Then so it pushes, you're adding energy to the swing as it's moving backwards. Now because you added energy, it actually moves a little bit further past what would technically be its rest point or its equilibrium point. Actually, I think that's the proper term for the equilibrium point. But as it moves past that point, it would reach some rest point where it has zero energy, and then zero kinetic energy, and then it moves forward again. As it moves forward again, you would push energy or push with your body again to add energy in that momentum, and then you keep doing that, right? And what you're actually doing is when you push with your body, you're adding energy to it in a sense phase, right? We'd use the term phase to describe the motion. I think that would be described as simple harmonic motion. I think you could describe that as simple harmonic motion, which basically just talks about motion of a wave. So as you push, in phase or at the proper time, the swing keeps moving further and further past the equilibrium point, and it develops more energy, right? I think the proper term would be mechanical energy, but when you're at the equilibrium point, I believe you would have the most kinetic energy, and then when you're at rest and you're about to move backwards, you have the most potential energy, which would just be mechanical energy altogether. Now, that's actually almost exactly how your subconscious actually builds energy, right? Or how it charges energy. So, we haven't talked too much about subjects yet. We're actually going to talk about that. I think this is going to be the last video of the chapter, so we're going to start talking about subjects in much more detail next chapter. You're going to see what roles the subject plays, which is a very important role. But for now, let's just say, in order to enter transcendental state, so just going over what we already spoke about, you would focus on some subject, which I don't think I mentioned before, but you would focus on a particular subject. So that could be a person, place, or a thing. But you would focus on a subject and then hold the intention to feel some emotion more. So let's say I want to feel inner peace, right? Let's say the subject is an environment. So I imagine myself, in nature or something, right? And I imagine myself in nature, so that would be the subject technically. And I would hold the intention to feel more peace while I'm imagining myself in that environment. So I would hold that intention to feel inner peace until I enter a transcendental mental state. Right now, after about 7 to 10 seconds, I'll enter a transcendental state. I would, around the 7 to 10 second mark, I would feel my subconscious pulling me or compelling me to enter a daydream-like state. And then I would allow my mind I would acquiesce, so I would sort of let my mind drift into a daydream-like state. I would stop holding the intention at that point and just kind of let my mind drift. And when I enter a daydream, I would allow myself I would use my subconscious instinct, right, to start trying to manipulate the environment and trying to feel more of the inner peace emotion, right? Now, after a few seconds, my state of awareness is going to fall back into a ground state, right? So once your awareness falls out of a transcendental state, you notice you'll feel less emotion. So in other words, when I go back into my ground state, right, I'm going to notice that, and I'll notice this is happening because of pretty much everything we discussed. So when I enter a transcendental state, the daydream or the environment in my imagination is going to feel way more vivid and way more, my intention is going to be much more focused on it, right? So that's just transcendental imagination, right? So like I said, your imagination feels much more like it's in HD or high definition. And when you're in a transcendental state, you're going to notice that, right? You're going to feel more emotion, and you're going to notice your imagination feels much more realistic, and it's much more, it feels more high definition. And that'll only feel that way for a few seconds. Now, when you fall out of a transcendental state, you're going to notice that goes away, right? Your imagination doesn't feel as much as it was before. It's not going to feel as much like HD. And then you're also not going to feel as much emotion. So you're not going to feel the inner peace emotion that you were trying to charge, right? So your emotion is going to feel flat. Your imagination is going to feel flat. Your belief will feel flat. So basically, the effects, the transcendental effects, when you're in a transcendental state of awareness went away. So now let's say you repeat the process. So you focus on the same subject. So I focus again. So that part's important. I focus again on that same environment I imagined before, and I hold the intention again to enter to feel more emotion until I enter a transcendental state. And then right around 7 to 10 seconds, when I feel my mind trying to enter a daydream again, I let it happen. So I stop holding the intention. I just allow my mind to drift into a transcendental state. Now, here's what's important. You're going to notice that when you do it the second time, it's a little bit different than you experienced the first time. And the difference is that you're going to feel a little more emotion than you did before. Really, all transcendental abilities. But what you're going to notice is that feeling of inner peace, you can now feel it more strongly than you did before. It's easier, right, to feel it. It feels more intense. Even the transcendental imagination is going to feel more intense. It's going to feel like it's even more in HD. A little, not that much more, but a little more than before, right? So you're going to feel that for a few seconds, and then when your mind goes back into a ground state, it's all going to go away again, right? Now, if you keep repeating this process, you're going to notice something interesting happens, right? You're going to notice that every time you enter a transcendental state, you're going to feel a little more emotion and a little more. It's going to feel a little more intense than it did before. And your imagination is going to feel more high definition, a little bit more high definition than it did before. And it's going to keep increasing, right? Now, why does that happen? Now, actually, that occurrence actually represents your subconscious charging, right? So the emotion becomes more and more intense each time you do it because it's charging, right? Now, the emotion is actually going to stick around even after you go back into a ground state. We'll talk more about that in chapter 9. So we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. But just for now, just talking about the transcendental state, you'll feel it more and more, and that represents the emotion charging or growing, right? So why does that happen? Well, charging, just go over this next point, charging occurs through the back and forth activity between holding an intention when you're in a normal state of awareness, or your subconscious is in this ground state, and performing the certain subconscious action, so whether that be emotion or transcendental imagination, when you're in a transcendental state of awareness. Now, the subconscious energy, so basically as you keep going back and forth between those actions, right, subconscious energy that builds up when you're in a transcendental state of awareness, it lingers around. So remember what we said, it has a transient nature to it. It doesn't instantaneously sort of build itself up and instantaneously go away right away. It sticks around. It takes time to build up, and it takes time to go away. So if I produce an emotion, right, at some level of intensity while in a transcendental state, even if I went back to the ground state, some of that subconscious energy from that emotion is still there, right? So it's still around. Now, when I go back to a transcendental state that second time, what's actually happening is that when I try to produce emotion again, it piggybacks or boosts, it gets a boost or piggybacks off the previous energy that was still lingering around. So it's like when you're on a swing and someone pushes you, right? So it gets a push, and that allows me to charge even more, or it allows me to build up even more emotional energy or subconscious energy than before. And then when I go back to a ground state again, now there's two instances. So we'll just make up terms here. There are two instances of energy that are now lingering around. So when I go back to a ground state, when I go back to a transcendental state a third time, now those two types of energy left over from before, or those two instances of energy left over from before, are now giving me a boost. So now when I produce more emotion, of the inner peace emotion, I can get a boost off those two forms of energy. So now I can make it, now my experience of emotion, or how much emotion I'm able to produce, or how intense I'm able to make it, is going to be even more intense. And as I keep doing this over and over and over, energy keeps being left around from each iteration. And each iteration of this back and forth activity will add to a new iteration, right? And it'll add to it and make it more intense and more intense and more intense. And so, in other words, that's how the subconscious charges. So every time you sort of repeat this back and forth activity, right? So you hold an intention when you're in your subconscious ground state, or in a normal state of awareness. You hold it for 7 to 10 seconds. It's the same intention for each iteration, but you hold a certain intention. Then you enter a transcendental state. You express some subconscious action, right? You're really you're going to express all of them at once. But if you're just if you're charging one particular subconscious action, in this case emotion, we'll just focus on that for the moment. You express more emotion while in a transcendental state, and then you go back to your ground state. And then you repeat the cycle. As you keep repeating that cycle, the energy keeps lingering around, and it keeps helping or boosting the subconscious action that you produce in the next iteration, and the next iteration, and the next iteration, and makes it more and more intense. And so that intensity represents the subconscious charging up, right? So I can produce emotion more and more and more intensely, which is what we said happens when your subconscious charges. So that's basically the charging process. All you have to do is keep going back and forth, keep entering a transcendental state over and over and over and over again. Now you have to focus on the same subject, right? Because the energy that lingers around is going to be, is associated with the subject, or the point of focus that you are focused on. And that's actually what all of next chapter is actually going to talk about, because there's way more things to talk about with that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how the subconscious charges. Now, when you're, I didn't really write it here, but when you're basically talking about the process of entertainment, right? So how does this happen when you're watching a movie or listening to music? Then just during those activities, you feel more emotion, and your emotion grows in intensity, right? So in other words, it's charging. That's actually why you're entertained from those activities. Like we said, when your subconscious is charging during some activity, you're feeling more and more emotion from that activity, and that's what it means to be entertained. So how is this happening when you're listening to music or watching movies? Well, when you're watching a movie, right? And again, you've probably never noticed this, but when you're watching a movie, the movie doesn't just jump from scene after scene after scene after scene, right? In a way that makes no sense to you, right? It's not going to make sense. It stays on a certain scene. It stays in a certain area for a long enough time for you to kind of make sense of what's happening. But what's really happening is that as a lot of your attention is on the movie, right? Now remember, your subconscious responds more strongly when you focus on something with a lot of attention. But as a lot of your attention is on the movie, you actually end up holding an intention due to the reflection principle. You end up holding it until you enter a transcendental state. Now, once you enter a transcendental state, your subconscious, you'll still be holding an intention, but more specifically, your subconscious instinct will start to kick in, and it'll start doing things based on the intention that you held, which was based on the movie. So your subconscious is really just going to imagine things and make you feel emotions based on the movie itself. So it just kind of copies what's going on, right? And that's actually kind of what happens when you're in a hypnotic state, right? So movies kind of put you in a hypnotic state. The movie itself acts as a suggestion, right? So your subconscious mind, when you're in a transcendental state of awareness as you're watching the movie, right? And the same principle happens when a hypnotist is hypnotizing a person. When they tell them to sort of relax their mind and enter a trance-like state, what's really happening is they're relaxing while listening to the voice of some hypnotist. The hypnotist's voice actually acts as the subject, but when they're focusing on their voice, they'll hold an intention for 7 to 10 seconds. They enter a transcendental state. Their subconscious has become quantized to just follow the command of the hypnotist. And So when they're in the transcendental state, their subconscious instinct is continuing to do what what your intention quantized it to do, which is to do whatever the hypnotist says. So the hypnotist will say something when you're in the transcendental state, and the subconscious receives it as a suggestion, and so your instinct just does whatever the hypnotist says. And so it'll charge in some way that's based on the hypnotist commands. And generally in hypnotism, that's used, for example, to even help people overcome addictions. Because addictions are commands that come from the physical body. The body's telling the subconscious to keep wanting this. And so your subconscious instinct keeps producing an urge to want something. Then that urge impacts the conscious mind to make a decision to get the said thing. But a hypnotist will present a suggestion to the subconscious to try to override the body's command when it says you don't want this. So the subconscious instinct produces an urge which says, I don't want this. And then that urge is going to be at odds with the body. And so they kind of fight each other a little bit. But over time, as the conscious mind keeps charging the subconscious, eventually it's going to charge in a way that sort of overpowers the body. And then the conscious mind won't feel the urge as much because the subconscious isn't compelling it as powerfully to want it. And really, at one point, it's just going to be two compulsions. All right, the charge from the body is going to say, get this thing that you're addicted to. And the charge from the mind, or from was done from the hypnotist or performed by the hypnotist, is going to say you don't want this thing. So it's going to be a little easier not to get the thing you're addicted to. But as you keep having more sessions with the hypnotist, and as you keep charging, your subconscious instinct will charge more and more and more to just say, I don't want this, right? And then you're going to kind of feel disgusted by the thing you're addicted to, and that helps people get over addictions. So that's how suggestion works in hypnotism, but the same process is occurring when you're being entertained. So when you watch a movie and you enter a transcendental state, the movie will act as a suggestion, and it continues to act as a suggestion, but also you are holding an intention before you enter the transcendental state, and then your subconscious instinct just starts thinking things and doing things based on the movie itself, right? So it could get more into the story of the movie. You should start having transcendental imagination that just copies or reflects the movie. Same thing with music. When you're listening to music, you'll hold intention for 7 to 10 seconds, and then you enter a transcendental state, and then you start daydreaming or imagining things based on the music that you're hearing, and the music acts as a suggestion. So you'll notice when you listen to music, and you're very emotionally moved or stimulated by it, that means your subconscious is charged up. And then you're going to notice things, just sort of ideas and fantasies playing in your mind. It's almost like a music video, right? That comes from transcendental imagination, and that's your subconscious instinct responding to the intention that you held while you were, that's your subconscious instinct responding to the intention that you held while you were listening to the music. And when you're in a transcendental state, you're in a basically daydream-like state. That's just a reflection of the intention you held and the song that you're listening to. So when that daydream-like state, when you're listening to music, is very important because it's there that your subconscious is charging up to feel more emotion. So that happens when you're listening to music. It happens when you're watching a movie, when you're playing a video game, when you're playing sports. It happens all the time, right? So if you're watching sports or watching a movie or even reading a book, if you find that entertaining, just look out for those moments. You may not have even noticed this, but look out for it, if you want to see this in action, or the entertainment aspect in action. You're going to notice that at some point your mind almost feels like it's entering a daydream-like state, and you're sort of just kind of daydreaming. Whether when you're watching a movie or listening to music or playing a video game, you're going to feel, but sometimes the daydream is very much just a reflection of what you're focused on, so you may not notice it as much, but you're going to notice there are moments where you feel very into what the activity itself, and that's transcendental perception, right? So your subconscious is charged and altering your perception and compelling you to be highly focused on the activity. But I think it's easiest to notice with music, right? Because that's mostly audio, so your visual part of your mind is more freed up. So you'll notice when you're listening to music that's very emotionally moving, you're going to notice that you're entering a daydream-like state, and your mind's imagining things almost like a music video. So I think that's it, right? So that's everything for this chapter. In the book, I made a kind of I wouldn't call it a bonus section, but I made one other section that's really going to be for physicists, so it's not that important, but I talk about, if you listen to what I've been saying about back and forth activity, and I think I even mentioned simple harmonic motion, you're going to notice it sounds very much like a wave, right? So I used to, when I was developing all of this, at one point I started calling it a consciousness wave, right? So a consciousness wave really refers to exactly the back and forth activity that I was talking about. It's like if you maintain that wave or that repeat behavior, back and forth behavior, the subconscious just charges more and more and more. And I think in the book, if you really want to get into the sort of model it after physics, you can even actually model it after the wave equation, really, and not even just like the regular wave equation. You can model it after quantum mechanics, the Schrodinger equation, because the Schrodinger equation is a linear equation, right? And it's a linear equation that, I'm trying to remember, it's a linear equation where the wave function is, it is a function defined on a infinity vector space, or I think it's called a Hilbert space, right? And so it's a Hilbert space, and the wave function is considered to be a state vector, and that state vector has, I'm trying to remember, the state vector can be expressed as a linear combination, or the wave function can be expressed as a linear combination of state vectors, right? And so the basis, right, or I think the covector, right, of the basis or the covector of, which I think in quantum mechanics is called Bra and Ket notation. So the covector represents, well, no, I'm thinking of it in different terms. It would be like the Bra notation. The Bra notation, or I think that is the covector, that represents different bases, right, or different basis values. And in this theory, you can make an argument that the basis, every value that the basis represents, that spans the wave function, each one of those can almost represent a different frequency, right? And so, yeah, that would actually, you can actually use the Schrodinger wave equation to model almost like model a wave function for the subconscious mind. Now, if you're not a physicist, none of this makes sense, right? So you're not really, and it's not really important. This is just a kind of funny way that I think about it, which I put in the book. Even the phase angle, so the phase angle of the wave function, which I don't know if they even use that much in quantum mechanics, but you can even use that to sort of talk about the where any charge or any back and forth process you are. So, and then the amplitude would represent the intensity of the charge, things like that. So this is not that important, right? But this is just kind of a funny way I was thinking about subconscious charging. So it very much models itself after a wave. Now, some people say the Schrodinger wave equation isn't, some people feel like it's not entirely a wave equation. I remember I saw this one video that said it was more like the heat equation, which is actually, I saw other comments that said that wasn't true, because the wave equation is a complex equation, right? So it's based on complex numbers. That's why it's still a wave equation, even though the differential equation doesn't exactly match the wave equation. So the heat equation, I think, is more like a diffusion equation. But anyway, right, you can see that the subconscious still kind of follows a wave-like nature to it when it comes to charging. But none of that's important, right? So I don't talk about that at any other point in the book. That's just like a funny, interesting way of mentioning it. And I'm not a physicist, so that's kind of my understanding. I kind of forgot a lot of stuff about quantum mechanics. But, if you are a physicist and that is your field, you'll probably be able to make sense of that portion of the book. But yeah, so this is everything for Chapter 8. Now there's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about in terms of timing, right? So, for example, how long, right, does energy linger around, right? If I keep doing this back and forth iteration, does it just charge forever, right? So we haven't talked too much about timing. Now the timing component of charging is what pretty much all of next chapter and Chapter 10 are going to be about. And then all of that's going to be very important to talk about these subjects, right, when it comes to timing. So, Chapter 7, we spoke a lot about the command component of your intentions in chapter 8. This chapter we talked a lot about the subconscious action and your subconscious instincts. In chapter 9 and 10, we're going to now move on to talking more about the subject component of your intention and how the subconscious responds to the subject component, which that's going to have to do with subconscious memory. So that's a very important part of understanding subconscious charging, and that's pretty much all of chapters 9 and 10 are going to be about. All right, so yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.